Hello, my name is Yakov Fagan. I am the Associate Director of the Future of Capitalism at the Berggruen Institute. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. David Sieple. Dr. Sieple is Associate Fellow for the Institute of Advanced Studies and Culture at the University of Virginia and a Horizons Fellow at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study in Uppsala, Sweden. He was a 2018 to 2019 Berggruen Fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. Today, he will be presenting work from his upcoming book, Our Corporate Civilization in Crisis: Constitutional Democracy, the Corporation, and the Question of Control, which examines the legal origins of the corporate form and its role in shaping our modern polities. Thank you very much for listening.
The corporate form not only structures most large business firms, but also universities, towns, churches, and most other nonprofits, and has heavily influenced the structure of the modern constitutional state, as I will explain. Unfortunately, our canonical social theorists fail to provide us with concepts adequate to our corporate world, including our corporate economy. Adam Smith, like his Chicago School Lionizers, theorizes a world of small proprietors, individual producers and consumers interacting in a market. Marx theorizes a world of large proprietors with capital concentrated in ever fewer hands. Max Weber generalizes this. Separation of the worker from the means of production is paralleled by the separation of the soldier from the means of warfare, the official from the means of administration, the scientist from the means of research, and so on. Although to Weber, this leads not to revolution, but to bureaucratization. But the important question that even Weber failed to ask is, who or what now holds title to all of this working property? What makes these separations possible at their present scale? The answer is juridical persons, either states or especially corporations. This socializes property. Marx was thus, in a sense, right in his prediction that private property would become a fetter upon the productive powers of capital to be burst asunder and replaced by socialized property. But it has been socialized at the level of the corporation, not the state. The result is that today, almost all productive property, as well as all government property, all church property, and most civil society property, is owned not by natural persons, but by abstract legal entities. We imagine that we continue to live in a private property economy, a bourgeois capitalist economy, in which the means of production are owned by natural persons, the capitalists. We do not. Ours is a corporate property economy in which legal entities are the owners. Or put another way, a corporate firm is a special form of sole proprietorship in which the legal entity is the proprietor. This shift of ownership from natural persons to legal entities has profound consequences. For one, it dramatically augments collective power. Entity ownership allows property to be dedicated in perpetuity to specific activities, vastly increasing the achievable scale and time frame of joint human activity. From medieval cathedrals built over generations to modern multinationals spanning the globe, entity ownership makes possible that which would otherwise be impossible. Further, it creates a possibility of improved governance of these undertakings. Control is no longer determined by ownership, since the entity owns. Wealth thus loses its claim upon rule, allowing leadership to be recruited more widely and allowing constitutional government structures to replace autocratic and oligarchic ones. Entity ownership does much else besides. It shifts liabilities from natural persons to legal entities. It alters incentive structures, alters the distribution of benefits, and alters class structures and societal dynamics. Yet it is woefully under-theorized or mis-theorized, largely because of our insistence on reducing all social life, including corporations themselves, to natural individuals in association. The book I've been working on is intended as a corrective, developing the analytical categories, historical narratives, and normative frameworks needed to properly understand our corporate civilization, and then applying them to the current crisis of neoliberal economy and constitutional democracy. With regard to political economy, much attention is currently being given to the problem of rapidly increasing economic inequality, and rightly so. It not only raises questions about the fairness and thus legitimacy of the economic system, but also has adverse consequences for matters as disparate as human health, the environment, and democratic politics. The result is a large literature focusing on ownership, with titles such as Capital in the 21st Century, The Code of Capital. And the main point I want to bring across today is that despite its importance, ownership is not the fundamental issue. The distribution of wealth is the cumulative result of the distribution of income, and the distribution of income is the result of the distribution of control is and always has been the fundamental issue, starting at the enterprise level, because those who control the firm control the distribution of its revenues. There's a reason this has been glossed over. In the economy of yesteryear, firms were overwhelmingly proprietorships whose owners had the control. It was therefore appropriate to focus on ownership as a good proxy for control. But in a corporate economy, control does not derive from ownership. Legal entities own the means of production. Natural persons get their control rights over this property from elsewhere, and I will describe what that is momentarily. So ownership is no longer a good proxy for control. Indeed, it has nothing to do with it. Ownership and control are totally decoupled. So to understand the distribution of income and wealth in a corporate economy, one must focus on the issue of control directly. Who has it and why? The system of corporate control also impacts important matters beyond the distribution of wealth, such as the use of coercion and surveillance in the workplace, the generation of negative externalities such as pollution, and the capture of the system. For all these reasons, we need to dig beneath questions about ownership to deeper questions about control. Corporate economy, which liberates control from ownership, creates an enormous opportunity for the public authority to implement corporate governance structures that bend the economy toward the public good. But this opportunity is lost upon us because of an enduring myth about corporations, that they are owned by their stockholders. This dupes us into thinking that ownership is still the key issue, and it puts us in a corporate governance straitjacket, believing that stockholders, as the owners, have a right to control the corporation and to engross all of its benefits. This myth constrains corporate governance even in a country like Germany, which pushes worker participation farther than any other, but still assigns stockholder representatives 50% of the seats on the supervisory board, plus the tie-breaking vote on grounds that they are the owners. So one thing I want to do today is dismantle this myth of stockholder ownership. At the end, I will say more about the negative consequences of this myth, but to motivate the discussion already here at the outset, allow me to make a few observations about today's typical stockholder to bring home how unmerited it is and how unpromising it is that they should be so privileged within the corporate firm. So today, most stockholders in the US are but rentiers, that is, passive outside investors, persons with no experience working in the industry, who have likely never set foot in one of the company's facilities and may be unaware even of what the company makes or does, attending only to their financial return from it. Many don't even know what stocks they own, owning them through retirement accounts. Furthermore, stockholders bear no liability for the debts of the corporation or the harms it might inflict, or significantly, even the crimes it might commit. Nor do they stay long, today on average only 4 months. Nor do most stockholders ever make any direct financial contribution to the firm because they purchase their shares from existing stockholders on the stock market, and not a penny of that goes to the corporation. Nor do corporations on balance seem much to need these stockholders, as they have for years been buying back more stock than they have been issuing, gathering all the financing they need from earnings or sale of bonds. In short, of all the parties involved with the firm, the stockholders are the most ill-informed, irresponsible, uncommitted, and unnecessary. Yet, they are the ones entitled to elect the board, and the board, according to the reigning corporate governance ideal, is to attend solely to their financial returns over the well-being of the workers, customers, the community, the environment, or even the long-term well-being of the company itself. This makes no sense. It's an inheritance from an earlier age, but today it creates a host of problems and is proving itself to be incompatible with constitutional democracy and its values, as I will explain. Reform of corporate governance is thus the principal policy goal of the book. But on the reigning theory, there's little that can or should be done because the stockholders are taken to be the corporation's owners. Management's job is to work for them. So the first step in reform is to displace the reigning theory of corporations with something better. So let's try. The corporate form is a legal technology pioneered by the Romans. It is not a technology for business, but for governance. In the 11th century, Europeans got hold of it through the books of Roman law and launched a gradual reorganization of church, civil society, and state along corporate lines. The result was a thick web of corporations, monasteries, cathedral chapters, confraternities, towns, universities, and guilds that governed the associational life of medieval Europe. Business enterprise was for long not on this list. It was not the first, but the last major application of the corporate form. So to understand the corporation as a governance technology, it will be helpful to begin with a non-business example. So the Latin word for corporation is universitas. Uni means one, vers means to turn. So an universitas is a collection of things turned into one. You will recognize this to be the root of the English word university. When I was young and foolish, I imagined universities were so named because they aspired to universal knowledge. Now that I'm middle-aged and foolish, I realize university just means corporation. The Universitas Scholarium, an incorporation of scholars, a collection of scholars turned into one. One what? One legal entity or juridical person. Okay, this entity, and here just describe what it is. This entity owns all the institutional property, makes all the contracts, bears all the liabilities, and appears in court in its own name, although acting through natural persons as legal representatives. This entity or person could be thought of as a mystical unity of members on the analogy with the universal church, and was then often described as a body politic as opposed to a body natural, a creation of political art. Or it could be thought of as a memberless abstraction, as is more common today. Either way, the corporation's property and contracts are wholly separate from that of the natural persons associated with it. How separate? Under English law, married women couldn't own land or legally control property, but they could incorporate into one body politic, elect an entirely female board, and in this way legally run a charity with a large endowment, because an incorporated body of women was evidently construed as male. This shows especially clearly that the property of the legal person is not the property of the human associates. A second feature of every corporation is that it has a jurisdiction. And this is usually forgotten about corporations. Here are some examples: monasteries, towns, etc. These are corporations that have the right to issue rules and even commands beyond the law of the land, so long as not inconsistent with it. You may notice that these two features of the corporation are also the defining features of a state. That is, it's a separate legal entity. The state owns the tanks, not the president, and it has a jurisdiction in which it can legislate and so on. We end up defining corporation and state in the same breath, and this is not so surprising if we look at their origins. As Justinian's Digest explicitly notes, the corporation, quote, is modeled on the state. The first corporations in law were Roman cities, which had separate property and a jurisdiction. And one such city, the city of Rome, was also the state, the civitas. From the very beginning, corporation and state have been linked concepts and linked realities, and one cannot tell the history of the one without the other. In the modern university, the ultimate authority to set the rules and control the property and personnel lies with the board. The really key question is, from where does the board get its authority? The answer is it comes from the state via a corporate charter. I'd like to show you what this looks like in practice, so I'm going to impress and to serve as the charter of my erstwhile home university, the University of Denver, whose original name was the Colorado Seminary. And the very first words, the sovereign or semi-sovereign, being a state, or here the territory, be it enacted by the Council and House of Representatives of the Colorado Territory. Here it establishes the corporate body or juridical person. Again, this is on the metaphor of the mystical body of Christ, that is the church, with the members of the church as the members of the body. But still that body is wholly separate from the individual members in the legal sense. And here it lists, these 2 individuals and 26 others, hereby constituted a body politic and corporate for the purpose of founding, directing, and maintaining an institution of learning to be styled the Colorado Seminary and to have perpetual succession, meaning it can live forever. Note it has a specific purpose. This, just continuing with that passage, shows that its juridical personhood is being created. That body politic will have full power to sue and be sued, plead and be pleaded, adopt and alter at pleasure as seal, that's the signature of the corporation, acquire, hold, and convey property, real, personal, and mixed, for carrying into effect the object of this incorporation, that is education. The charter also mandates the governance structure of the corporation. It sets up the government. Said trustees at their first meeting shall be divided into 4 classes of 7 in each class, which classes shall hold office for 1, 2, 3, and 4 years respectively, dating from the first. I don't go into all the specifics of this, but that it's really setting up how this is going to be structured and how it's going to be run. Then it establishes this government's legislative and executive authority. The trustees shall have power to adopt all proper rules and regulations for the government of the conduct of teachers and pupils and the management of all affairs pertaining to the said institution. Then finally, this wasn't included in the original charter, but it's always implicit in all corporations and was added later in this clause. The Board of Trustees of this corporation shall have power to make such prudential bylaws not inconsistent with the Constitution and the laws of the state of Colorado and these articles of incorporation. If this clause wasn't here, it would be a full-fledged state in its own right. Because it's here, it shows that it is subordinate to the laws of the state that founds it. So charters make transparent the state origins of the corporate entity, its government, and its governing powers. Yet it is not so surprising that we lose sight of this state dependence. Once the corporation is erected and empowered by the state, it operates independently of it. It hires its own personnel, it secures its own financing, it manages its own affairs. Because of this, it's easy to imagine that there is no role played by the state at all. Its role instead is the constitutional one of creating the legal entity, mandating its governance structure, and delegating authority to it. The corporation is thus a public-private hybrid created in the state's own image. The state extends to the corporation the state's own legal form and jurisdictional authority to be utilized for purposes the state approves under procedures it prescribes. It is, one might say, a replicant of the state's mini-me. So everything said so far holds also for the business corporation, but we get confused when stockholders enter the picture and we start to think the corporation is a private partnership of stockholders. And we hear it said that stockholders own the corporation and that they give the board its authority, just as if they were the partners of a partnership. This is, for example, the view promulgated by Milton Friedman in a famous polemical piece from 1970 that expresses the emerging Chicago neoliberal view. In a free enterprise private property system, a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business. Of course, he means the stockholders. He has direct responsibility to his employers. That responsibility is to conduct the business in accordance with their desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible. So Friedman is suggesting that the corporation is a kind of partnership with the stockholders, as partners jointly own the firm's assets and managers are their employees. And here you see it's really a legal entity, the corporation that owns the assets. Stockholders are just off to the side. They get to elect the board. They don't really own the property in any way. The property, they can't use the property. They can't exclude others from it. They can't lend it to others. They can't collateralize it. They can't sell it. These rights of ownership all belong to the corporate entity. What stockholders own are shares of stock, a financial instrument. Stockholding brings certain rights, but not ownership rights. The assets of a corporate firm are owned by the corporate entity, just as the assets of a university are. It is capitalism without the capitalist. So jurisdiction, the authority of the board also does not derive from the stockholders. It is true that in Anglo jurisdictions, the stockholders select the person who occupies the office of director. But this does not mean that the authority of the office derives from the stockholders. Like the office of university trustee, the office of director is created by the charter issued by the state. At no point do stockholders have authority to manage the corporation, and they cannot delegate what they do not have. Indeed, in the US, the stockholders need not exist at the time the board is created and begins running the company. The board then issues the shares, which creates the stockholders. The board creates the stockholders, do not create the board. The board is thus not their employee or agent. Historically, most cogently, the duty of the board was not to the stockholders, but to the corporation and its chartered purpose. Business corporations are not creatures of the market, but a public-private hybrid licensed to colonize the market. I believe there are normative implications to be drawn from this account of the corporation's ontology. First, given the debt of every corporation to the public authority for its very existence, it would be reasonable to expect corporations to serve the public interest, not just the pecuniary interests of the stockholders. Second, given that the board's authority over the employees comes from the public authority, it would be reasonable to expect corporate employees to have at least some of the rights and protections of public employees. Third, recall that the US Constitution requires the states to maintain a republican, that is a popularly accountable form of government. Why then do our states, which do most of the corporate chartering, erect and empower corporate governments that are unaccountable and autocratic rather than republican to rule over their citizens during their working hours? This may not be technically unconstitutional, but is certainly inconsistent with the republican principles states are supposed to uphold. And even from the vantage point of business performance, it appears to be a suboptimal approach, judging from the success of the more republican corporations of the Germanic and Nordic countries. And here's an interesting point. The corporations of ancient Rome and most of the civil corporations of medieval and early modern Europe did operate as little republics, and indeed for long were the principal carriers of republican thought and practice in Europe. Recall those medieval universities. The faculty were the members, and they elected a government over themselves in the form of a rector who was accountable to them. I call these member corporations, although one could as easily call them republican corporations. Alas, things are much changed. Today, universities have no members. Their charters give all authority directly to the board, as you saw, which in principle rules autocratically. Today, universities are thus better described as autocratic incorporations of property rather than republican incorporations of members. And the same is true of modern business corporations in contrast to the medieval guilds. I'll have more to say about this. This presents us with a paradox. The monarchical states of medieval and early modern Europe primarily chartered republican corporations, while the constitutional republics of the modern period primarily charter autocratic corporations. What is more, behind this paradox lurks another one. Namely, one of those early modern republican corporations, the Merchant Guild, is the common ancestor of both the constitutional republic and the business corporation. The constitutional republic inherited the guild's republican structure, but the business corporation twisted that structure into its opposite, an autocratic structure. I unfold these contradictory developments in the middle chapters of the book, and I'm also going to say a word about that now. The setting is England's first corporate empire. In the 16th century, the English crown watched anxiously as the Spanish and Portuguese built their overseas empires. It felt that to survive, it had to do something similar. But the problem was the crown was flat broke. So it chartered corporations, typically merchant guilds, to establish overseas colonies and overseas trade, thus mustering private capital and organizational capacity to this state-sanctioned end. Importantly, the corporations it chartered evolved differently in the different places. In Massachusetts, the Merchant Guild evolved into a constitutional democracy. In the Indies, the Guild evolved into the modern business corporation. So let's look first at what happened in New England. The first thing to note is that the earliest American colonies were literal corporations of the crown. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, for example, was officially the Massachusetts Bay Company, not a unified business firm, but nonetheless a for-profit colonial venture with a guild structure. Long story short, Puritans got control of the board and, once in Massachusetts, opened up membership in the company to all male heads of household who were church members in good standing, which was the overwhelming majority of the men. That meant they would participate in the General Assembly of corporate members to elect the board and to pass bylaws or ordinances for the colony, that is, to legislate. In essence, the leaders converted the company into a republic of churchgoers, with the corporate charter functioning as its written constitution. But now let me be more precise. It was from this experience that Americans got their understanding of what a constitution is, a written document, a charter that authorizes and limits a government. Prior to this, the term constitution just referred to a country's overall social organization. Constitutions were not legal documents that established and limited the government. This idea comes from living under a corporate government. What is more, Americans liked their government limited by charter. They associated it with republican liberty, freedom from arbitrary rule. Life under a sovereign government, such as Parliament, they associated with despotism, even political slavery. They didn't want their governments to be sovereign. But the break with Britain left the Americans with a problem. Their existing chartered governments had all been chartered by the crown, whose authority they had just thrown off. This left their chartered governments groundless, unauthorized, unlimited, and there was no sovereign to turn to recharter them. Or was there? So this was the great American innovation, to synthesize corporate chartering with popular sovereignty. Just as a sovereign king could issue a corporate charter that founds a legally limited government, so could a sovereign people. The US Constitution is not a social contract in the vein of social contract theory, which is the prevailing view. Rather, it is or takes the form of a popularly issued corporate charter. And the preamble is the classic purpose clause of that charter. So setting aside the ins and outs of how the Federalists orchestrated this, let's turn straight to the structural homology. Authorized and limited by a charter issued by the king, owns property and makes contracts in its own name, that's a juridical person. Its officers are not legal agents of the king, instead they're fiduciaries to the purposes established in the charter. The king does not directly participate in the government, but that government may not act outside the bounds of the king's charter. Its statutes may not be inconsistent with the king's law. These restrictions are enforced by the king's courts rather than by the king directly. But the king reserves the right to amend the charter if unhappy with the way things are going. And replace king with people, right? That's just one word changed. Here we have modern constitutional government. It's authorized and limited by a charter issued by the people. It owns property, makes contract in its own name, is a juridical person, that's the state. Its officers are not legal agents of the people, right? They're all elected representatives, not agents. Instead, they're fiduciaries to the purposes established in the charter, the Constitution. The people does not directly participate in the government. They all have representation, but that government may not act outside the bounds of the people's charter. Its statutes may not be inconsistent with the people's law. In both cases, that's the Constitution. These restrictions are enforced by the people's courts rather than by the people directly, constitutional review. And the people reserves the right to amend the charter if unhappy with the way things are going. So all the things that we think of as American constitutional innovations, constitutional conventions, written charters, judicial review, and charter amendment, and one might add elected executives, represent a transfer of instrumentalities used for governing corporations to the governance of the state. So this is a vivid example of the intertwined history of state and corporation. The corporation is a replicant of the state, a causal relationship, but the constitutional state is a replica of the chartered corporation, a mimetic relationship. So bequeathing constitutional government, constitutional democracy to the modern age was the last hurrah of the Republican corporation. If we now turn to the Indies, we see the emergence of a new kind of corporation. Its emergence is really a tale of two companies, the Dutch and the English East India Companies. The Dutch were the real innovators. Their company launched in 1602 as a kind of legalized cartel of 6 independent merchant groups or chambers. By 1623, it had been unified into a single enterprise with all the traits that present-day scholars associate with a modern business corporation: a permanent capital, legal personhood, separation of stockholder and management, limited liability for stockholders and directors, and tradable shares. Yet importantly, its stockholders were not under the illusion that they were either the members or the owners of the company. They recognized that they were not insiders but outsiders, and that what they owned was a mere financial instrument, not a portion of the company's assets on which they had no legal claim. Meanwhile, the English company went down a different path until it abandoned that path and copied the Dutch. The company was chartered in 1600 as a typical merchant guild, republican in structure, in which each member had the right to trade to the Indies. But in practice, they did not trade as individuals. Because of the great expense of equipping expeditions, subsets of the members entered into partnership, forming joint stock companies with a limited term. This made them both members and owners, members of the guild and part owners of the unincorporated joint stock partnerships. But these puny joint stock companies were no match for the Dutch company with its ever-growing permanent capital. So beginning in 1657, the English copied it. Trade was unified under one monopoly company. All assets were locked into the company and titled to the corporate entity. The merchants, formerly members and owners, became outside stockholders, and their apprentices became company employees, the new insiders, but without membership status. There is only one difference, although it is significant. The board members of the Dutch company were nominated by the merchants, but selected by the burgomeisters of the Dutch cities, integrating the company into the governance structure of the Dutch Republic. In the English company, however, the stockholders hung on to the electoral rights that they had as guild members and elected the board, although the voting rule gradually moved from one member, one vote to the non-membership principle of one share, one vote. Here I emphasize 4 points. First, this was a new class of corporation, not a collection of people turned into one, but a collection of property turned into one. A property corporation. In member corporations, the members elect a government over themselves on the principle of one person, one vote. In Anglo business corporations, one group, the stockholders, elects a government over another group, the employees, on the principle of one share, one vote for the purpose of labor extraction. That is no republic. It's an imperial relationship, and the business corporation can be thought of as an oligarchic empire over labor. Second, despite the transformation, the English stockholders continued to be styled the corporation's owners and members, a legacy of their previous position as partners and guild members. They adopted the Dutch form, but they retained their existing vocabulary to describe it, however awkwardly. And this set the mode for subsequent Anglo treatments of the corporation. Third, and somewhat soberingly, the Dutch governance model of mayoral selection was on most scores superior to the stockholder model, largely because, in what has become a familiar story, the stockholders were more interested in extracting revenues than in reinvesting them, leaving the English company chronically undercapitalized. The Dutch company was always larger than the English and retained its monopoly rights, or its monopoly over the spice trade, forcing the English to pioneer new markets in things like Indian calicos and Chinese tea. Finally, the history of these companies in Asia underscores that corporations are strongly governmental enough to acquire and manage an empire. Was the first undertaking in which for-profit business enterprises required massive amounts of dedicated, specialized capital on a scale that made the corporate form not only advantageous, but virtually indispensable. After that, banking, After that, infrastructure. After that, the Industrial Revolution. So a key advantage of tracing the Constitutional Republic and Business Corporation back to their common root, the Merchant Guild, is that it underscores their common nature. They use the same legal device for augmenting collective power. Namely, they dedicate property to a purpose in perpetuity by placing it in the hands of an undying legal entity. And both place that property under the control of a constitutional chartered government. More, each receives its charter and governing authority from the same ultimate authorizer, historically the king, today the people or state. The important implication is that for both, the question, who should control it, cannot be decided by asking who owns it, because an entity owns the property, not natural persons, has no legitimate property claim on the control of either. Instead, the sovereign authorizer sets their control structure. Each can thus hypothetically range from participatory democracy to constitutional dictatorship to anything in between, depending on the terms of the charter. The two have different purposes, so there's no reason to expect that their optimal governance structure would be the same. Nonetheless, for both, the choice among possible control structures should depend only on public policy criteria, such as organizational effectiveness, non-domination of subordinates, equitable distribution of benefits, and the minimization of negative externalities. This approach has been blocked with regard to the business corporation, however, because of that inaugural confusion that stockholders own it, which implies that all power and benefits should lie with them. Public authorities have therefore structured their control as if the stockholders were the owners or quasi-owners. So what happens when these two offshoots of England's corporate empire, the Constitutional Republic and the Imperial Business Corporation, try to cohabitate? Are they compatible? This was the single biggest question rocking American politics in its first decades, until the issue of slavery eclipsed it. And the question has never gone away. To understand this, it's helpful to bear in mind how much the valence of the corporation has changed. In the Middle Ages, if one were lucky, one could escape from one's feudal lord into an incorporated town, a republic-like member corporation, and after a year and a day, gain the freedom of the city air makes one free. But now the US was itself a republic, a medieval town blown up to national scale. And the type of corporations being chartered within it were increasingly authoritarian incorporations of property rather than Republican member corporations. Corporations, as some insightfully noted, had gone from being islands of Republican liberty within a sea of feudal servitude to islands of feudal servitude within a sea of Republican liberty, at least for those white and male. Also, since corporations normally were granted perpetual life, fears were expressed that over time, all productive property would be engrossed by them, leaving none for the average citizen. This completed the image of the corporation as being transformed from a haven against feudalism to a locus of a new feudalism. To this was added a worry about corporate corruption. The Boston Tea Party is misremembered. This wasn't a tax revolt so much as a corporate corruption revolt. It was the East India Company tea being dumped into the harbor because the company had bribed its way into an exemption from the shipping tax to which the American traders were subject to their competitive disadvantage. So corporations seemed to violate Republican equality, in that charters were just granted as special privileges to the few. Republican liberty they violated because it brought people back under the arbitrary authority of individuals they did not elect. And they undermined Republican virtue through the corrupting influence of concentrated wealth. It would be hard to deny that on each point, the early Americans were prescient. But I do want to make this final point. So the standard approach to addressing the problem of unequal economic wealth, accepts wealth's control over the production and distribution of wealth, for example, accepting stockholder domination of the corporation, and then tries through political means to redistribute wealth post-production in an ongoing manner, for example, through progressive taxation and direct and indirect transfers. I'm not opposed to this, but the problem is that when political power dictates distribution, it vastly increases the stakes of securing political power. Existing wealth therefore works to capture the political process. And that's basically the story of the US since 1970. So here's a slogan for an alternative approach. In a corporate economy, wealth should give one consumption rights, but not control rights. When one breaks wealth's control over the production and distribution of wealth, one simultaneously lowers the power of wealth and widens the distribution of wealth because the wealthy won't control its distribution. This widening does not depend upon redistribution by government and politics. It's pre-distribution, not redistribution. Those familiar with Michael Walzer's spheres of justice will recognize this as a Walzerian approach to the problem. Rather than trying to redistribute a dominant good like money, reduce its dominance by blocking its power in other domains. So the logical fear that in doing this you'll kill the goose that lays the golden egg, but this is clearly wrong. In a corporate economy, wealth exercises its control via stockholding, and stockholder governance is suboptimal in almost all circumstances. So breaking wealth's control over the production of wealth, therefore, has the potential to enhance the production of wealth, the potential to redirect it in pro-social directions while distributing the profits more broadly and equitably. And I have a number of examples here, from Germanic co-determination to Danish model of having nonprofit foundations owning for-profit businesses. But my time is up, and I'm more interested in hearing your comments and questions.
Thank you, David, for a really great presentation that I think throws into light a lot of first order questions about the status of property under a modern capitalist economy. And just to start out the discussion, I want to maybe ask you to clarify a little bit. You've spoken a lot about control, right? And the control being control primarily over cash flows. But what about the concept of ownership, which I think you juxtapose control against? What does ownership actually mean? Is it even a relevant thing for a corporation beyond its quote unquote startup phase? Could you expand on that a little bit and what that implies for the IPO process, for example, and whether we even want IPO funding over giving banks more control over corporations?
Yeah. So I would say, control in two respects. Yes, control over cash flow, but also control over workers. As I emphasized, that also comes from the charter from the state. Ownership, I mean, you're right. It's not a very useful concept when we're talking about corporations. If we're appealing to it to somehow guide us about what the corporation's purpose should be, who should have that control, what ends it should serve. Because as I say, the legal title to all these assets is held by the corporation. Now, ownership is still relevant in the sense of, because that is owned by the legal entity, there is still such a thing as trespassing on corporate property. There's a sense of the kind of privacy rights that it claims and so on. So it is still relevant to point out that there's a legal entity that owns the property. But in terms of the actual control, it's not a relevant concept. So in terms of IPOs, in that case, you have a company that's already up and running as some kind of a proprietorship or partnership, or often an LLC, which is already a quasi-corporation. Mm-hmm. I think there to think about what's happening with the ownership, let's say it's a partnership. What really happens is that the partners then really transfer their ownership to a legal entity that the state creates, and in return they get stock, which is a financial instrument. And so at that point, there it is, that now the title to all the assets is held by the legal entity. And from that point on, the former owners are just holders of a financial instrument and that they own and can sell and trade and burn or whatever. But yeah, I think that's how I'd think through that issue.
There are a couple of issues you bring up in the text of the paper, particularly the Germanic corporation. And first of all, could you speak a little bit to what practices are done in the Danish and German model? And then moreover, maybe you use this lineage, right? This Anglo common law lineage for the American style Anglo-American corporation, but there is a very different kind of lineage to the German corporation. And the question is whether that lineage outside of the common law and more in the universal banking system and family holding is what makes the difference and ultimately makes these more rationally held than the current Anglo-American corporation.
With respect to the Germanic and Nordic corporations, I'm actually here in Sweden. They speak, the German is the best known example and really takes this principle the farthest. So there they have a dual board structure. So there is the operating board, as we'd be more familiar with in the Anglo corporations. But on top of that sits a supervisory board. And that supervisory board is split 50-50 in terms of representatives elected by stockholders and representatives elected by labor, the employees, with the stockholders having the deciding vote. And there was, in fact, a German constitutional court case that, as I say, it upheld that as didn't violate stockholders' ownership rights because they at least had that deciding vote. So yeah, the history of that. So what I think you're referring to in terms of the alternative history of the German economy, are you speaking to the very famous Mittelstand, these kind of family-owned firms?
Yes, the Mittelstand, and then and then the more closely held bank representation on the board.
Yeah. Okay. So the Mittelstand is that's a separate. Those are these kind of family firms that use the equivalent of what we now call the LLC for their structure. It's one of the, I guess, sort of robust features of the German economy that it isn't all dominated simply by corporations. I would point to Taiwan as similar in this fact, a lot of family firms. But as to the distribution of the share ownership, in the US, there is a rule that banks cannot own more than 20% of the shares of the business corporation. And that was put in as probably in the New Deal to prevent that kind of dominance of the banks over the economy, JP Morgan and all that. Whereas that rule doesn't exist in Europe. And so you're much more likely to get banks as big block holders in Europe. And there is the tendency of these banks to be long-term block holders. And so they take a long-term perspective on the company. But in our case, we do have the emergencies block holders, but they're like mutual funds, pension funds, and particularly private equity funds. And they have portfolio managers who are compensated on a quarterly basis. And so they have to get their returns. They're in the portfolio every quarter, hit their numbers, or they're going to be pulled off the account. And so that just further institutionalizes the short-term orientation of the companies, that even those institutional investors are largely short-term ones, especially the private equity. Yeah, so that is an important difference in terms of how they operate.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on Citizens United, what you think the impact has been on some of the themes that you discussed, and whether you think it needs to go away, or maybe that's a fight that's not worth having and not, maybe more of a distraction than some other areas we need to focus on.
Yeah. All right. So I'll say two things with that. That's a great question, and I've published on that court case. The popular myth is that what the Supreme Court said in that case is that the corporation is a person and is a citizen, and therefore gets the same rights as citizens, such as to engage in electioneering. That's actually not what the case says. What the court says is that the corporation is just an association of citizens, okay, again, reducing it to the stockholders or the members. And they claim, Kennedy in his majority opinion says, we're not actually granting any rights to the corporation. We're just upholding the rights of its members, the associates who are citizens, and they have rights to electioneer. And so the board should be able to make these expenditures in elections. What the court doesn't understand is that you actually have a legal entity that owns the property. The stockholders already have all their individual accounts. They can spend as much money as they want in electioneering. And they can sell some of their shares of stock to get even more money to do that. What Citizens United does is enable the corporation, enable that treasury, right, to be used by management to argue for or against a candidate in an election. So it's absolutely representing corporations in our electoral system, even though they are not citizens or natural persons. So it's a horrible decision. And unfortunately, even the kind of four liberal dissenters, they didn't really know corporate theory well enough to be able to make this point and make some other kind of less trenchant criticisms of it. But in terms of our impact upon politics, at the moment, I would say Buckley v. Vallejo is the bigger issue, the fact that the money is considered speech. But I do believe that over time, the system of tapping into corporations as a source of campaign funds gets institutionalized and ratcheted over time. Once a company gets drawn to that system, it's very rare for them to leave it. Right, and the kind of payoff typically of those kind of contributions in terms of legislative favors later on is often very high. So I do think it will be a growing problem, even practically. I was really hoping we could get a new majority to overturn it, but now I'm in despair about that for another generation. We'll see.
Thank you for that.
I really want to thank David for his participating and for a really great talk. Thank you very much.
Great pleasure. All right, nice seeing you again, Yakov. Thanks everyone for joining. All right, take care. Be safe out there.
Bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Matter, a podcast by the Berggruen Institute that explores some of the biggest challenges facing our societies and shaping who we are as humans. During this time of great transformations, we need new ideas and deep, long-term thinking more than ever. We invite you to join us in discovery. You can find us on social media at Berggruen Institute, and please subscribe to Noema, our new digital and print magazine at noemamag.com.